They mocked her for buying the worst house on the block, until day 7 changed everything. The Victorian sagged at the edge of a fading factory town, paint peeling like forgotten memories. Neighbors watched from porches as a 69-year-old woman and her German shepherd stepped out of a dusty car and claimed it anyway. Someone laughed. Someone muttered she wouldn't last a week. She heard them all, and still signed her name. What no one realized was that the house wasn't as broken as it looked. Be honest. Would you have walked away from that house or taken the risk? Tell me what you'd have done. The first thing Evelyn Mercer noticed was the smell. Not the soft scent of old wood or fallen leaves, but something damp and metallic, like rust and rainwater left too long in a bucket. Now she slowed her aging Subaru as it turned off the cracked 2-lane road and onto Hawthorne Street, if you could still call it that. Most of the street signs in this part of Millbrook, West Virginia, leaned at awkward angles, as if they too were tired of standing. The house waited at the very end of the block. 3 stories tall, once elegant, now slouched under its own history. Faded gray paint peeled in long strips from the siding. The porch railing sagged at one corner, and 2 shutters hung crooked, tapping lightly against the brick whenever the wind shifted. The yard was less lawn and more wilderness, waist-high weeds tangled with brittle stalks of last season's brush. Someone had spray-painted a looping red tag across the back fence, bold and careless. Evelyn turned off the engine and sat in silence. At 69, and she had signed contracts for multi-million-dollar medical expansions without blinking. She had negotiated budgets, led departments, steadied crises in fluorescent-lit conference rooms. But her hands tightened on the steering wheel now as she stared at the house people had described as structurally questionable and a money pit. Behind her, a pickup truck slowed. She didn't have to look to know why. Millbrook had once been a factory town, humming with steel and machine noise. Now, the old plant stood half-empty along the river, and the town had grown suspicious of outsiders, especially ones who arrived alone in late summer with out-of-state plates and no visible family. The truck rolled past slowly. 2 men inside leaned toward the open window. "Well, I'll be," one of them said loud enough to carry. "Oh, I didn't think anybody was crazy enough." The other chuckled. "Won't last a week." The words landed harder than she expected. Evelyn inhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. She had heard worse in boardrooms. She had endured whispers after the hospital's restructuring announcement, after her name was placed in the column labeled "Eliminated." But this felt different. There was no professional courtesy here, just open amusement. A soft thump sounded behind her seat. "Coda," she murmured. The German shepherd lifted his head from the back seat, ears already alert. His amber eyes studied her face through the gap between the seats. He did not bark. He never barked unless something was truly wrong. "It's just us," she said quietly. She opened the door. The late August air was thick, humid in a way that made breathing feel like work, while gravel shifted beneath her shoes as she stepped onto the driveway, or what had once been a driveway. Cracks ran through it like veins. Coda jumped down beside her in one smooth motion, landing solid and steady. He stretched once, shook out his thick coat, and then stood close to her left leg, scanning the street with slow, deliberate turns of his head. Across the road, a woman paused mid-sweep on her porch. Another man leaned against his mailbox, arms folded. No one waved. The real estate agent, a young woman named Tara, who had looked increasingly apologetic during every showing, approached with a clipboard in hand. "You still sure?" Tara asked gently, lowering her voice. Evelyn glanced at the house again. Up close, she could see delicate trim carved along the porch columns, mostly intact beneath the peeling paint. The stained glass window near the top floor was cracked, but not shattered, its faded blues and greens still catching light. It had once been beautiful. "Yes," Evelyn said. Tara hesitated, then handed over the final paperwork. It's got potential." From somewhere down the street, a short bark of laughter cut through the quiet. Evelyn felt the heat rise along her neck. She imagined how she must look. Gray hair pulled into a low bun, linen shirt already wrinkled from the drive, standing beside a house everyone else had long ago dismissed as unsalvageable. A laid-off administrator buying what the bank had practically given away. The pen felt heavier than it should have. For a brief second, doubt whispered. She could still back out. She could call Travis, and he would tell her there was still room in that retirement complex he liked so much. Clean lawns, weekly bingo, no peeling paint, no men laughing from pickup trucks. Coda shifted slightly, brushing his shoulder against her thigh. She steadied herself. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. Her signature, Evelyn Mercer. Firm, unshaking. Tara smiled with visible relief. Congratulations. The word sounded strange here. The pickup truck circled back once more before disappearing down the block. As it passed, one of the men leaned out again. "Hope you like raccoons?" he called. Coda's ears twitched, but he did not move. Evelyn handed the clipboard back and accepted the small ring of keys. The metal was cool in her palm, lighter than she expected, almost delicate. For a moment, the street went quiet again, while the neighbors continued watching, waiting perhaps for hesitation, for tears, for second thoughts. Instead, Evelyn walked toward the porch steps. They creaked beneath her weight, but held. The front door stood tall and weathered, its brass knob tarnished nearly black. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a sharp click. Before opening it, she glanced back at the street. No one waved, no one smiled. They were still watching. Let them. Coda stood at her side, posture relaxed but ready. Evelyn drew in one steady breath and pushed the door inward. The darkness inside swallowed the afternoon light, and without looking back again, she stepped across the threshold. The air inside the house was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old plaster. Evelyn stood just beyond the doorway, and letting her eyes adjust. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of light slipping in through cracked curtains. Behind her, the front door creaked shut. Coda moved first. He padded across the warped hardwood floor, nails clicking softly, nose low, investigating corners and baseboards with careful precision. His body language wasn't tense, just alert, protective, as always. Evelyn stepped farther in. The entryway opened into what must once have been a formal parlor. Faded floral wallpaper peeled near the ceiling. A chandelier hung overhead, its glass drops coated in gray film. To her right, a staircase curved upward, elegant even in disrepair. The banister felt solid beneath her hand. It was not ruined. It was tired. She set her purse on the floor and walked slowly through the space, absorbing it. There was damage, yes. Sagging here, cracked molding there. But it stood. It had endured decades of neglect and still held its shape. A house no one wanted. She could understand why. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, vibrating against her hip. Travis. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice carried the familiar mix of concern and restrained impatience. He was calling from North Carolina, 2 states away, 3 hours of driving that somehow felt like 3 continents. "You there yet?" he asked. "I'm inside," she replied, scanning the ceiling where faint water stains traced soft brown halos. "It needs work." There was a pause on the line. "You don't have to do this," Travis said carefully. "The Meadows still has a unit available. They'll handle maintenance, security, meals. It would be easier." Easier. She leaned against the doorframe and closed her eyes briefly. The hospital boardroom flashed in her memory. Long table, glass walls, polite smiles. "Corporate restructuring," the CEO had said, smoothing his tie. "We're moving toward a centralized operations model. Your position is being eliminated." Eliminated. 32 years of service reduced to a slide on a presentation. She had kept her composure then. Thanked them for the opportunity. Gathered her framed certificates from the office wall herself. Smiled at nurses in the hallway who avoided her gaze. The severance had been modest. The retirement savings, already thin. Because years earlier, when her husband Daniel had been diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma, they had chosen treatment without hesitation. Experimental options, out-of-network specialists, flights, hotels, hope. And hope was expensive. Daniel had survived 5 more years. 5 good years. She would never regret that. But the savings account had never fully recovered. "Mom? I'm here," she said, returning to the present. "It's not about pride," Travis continued. "You don't have to prove anything. You've worked hard enough." She walked toward the back window and pushed aside the brittle curtain. The backyard stretched wild and uneven, bordered by that graffiti-marked fence. Beyond it, she could see the faint outline of the old factory's smokestack. "I'm not proving anything," she said evenly. "I just don't want to shrink." Another silence. "I don't want you struggling," he replied. "I won't." That wasn't entirely true. She knew it wouldn't be easy. But struggle wasn't new to her. When Daniel had first gotten sick, she had worked full shifts at the hospital and then spent nights beside him, tracking medication schedules by hand because the insurance portal had failed to update. She had navigated billing departments and insurance denials with the same steady voice she once used to manage staff conflicts. Struggle was manageable. What she feared was irrelevance. After the layoff, friends had called with soft voices. "Maybe this is the universe telling you to slow down. You've earned rest." Rest had begun to feel like erasure. At the retirement complex Travis liked, she had toured beige hallways and identical doors. Residents moved quietly between scheduled activities. There was safety there, predictability. But when the coordinator asked what hobbies she enjoyed, she had drawn a blank. Work had filled most of her adult life, and Daniel had filled the rest. The idea of sitting still in a climate-controlled apartment while waiting for dinner hours had made her chest tighten. "I need a project," she told Travis now. "I need something that's mine. You could volunteer." "I will, eventually." Coda's low huff echoed faintly from the hallway, followed by the sound of something shifting. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. "Mom," Travis pressed gently. "People in towns like that, they talk." She almost smiled. "I noticed." "Are you safe?" "Yes." She watched Coda reappear at the base of the staircase, ears forward, tail steady. He looked at her as if confirming the statement himself. "I'll call you tonight," she said. "After I unpack a little." Another pause, softer this time. "Okay," Travis said. Just don't push yourself too hard." "I won't." They hung up. The house settled with a faint groan somewhere above her head. Pipes shifted in the walls, the kind of sounds older buildings made when temperature changed. She slid her phone back into her pocket. In the parlor, dust motes continued their lazy drift, indifferent to layoffs and laughter and opinions from passing trucks. Evelyn walked toward the center of the room and turned slowly in place, studying every angle. The cracked ceiling medallion, the tall windows, the way afternoon light still found its way inside despite everything. She pictured it cleaned, repaired, restored. Not perfect, but standing. Coda returned to her side and leaned gently against her leg. She reached down and rested her hand on his broad head. "I know," she murmured. Outside, somewhere down the block, a screen door slammed. Inside, the house held its breath, and so did she. The house sounded different after sunset. During the day, its flaws had felt visible. Peeling paint, sagging corners, dust heavy in the air. But once darkness settled outside the tall windows, the flaws became voices. Evelyn stood in what she had decided would be the bedroom for now, a small front room with a single intact window and relatively level flooring. She had cleared it first, swept away broken plaster, wiped down the baseboards, unrolled a thin camping mattress she'd brought in case the upstairs proved unsafe. The overhead light flickered when she flipped the switch. Old wiring, she thought. She'd replace it eventually. For now, she left the light off and relied on the soft glow of a standing lamp she had plugged into the least temperamental outlet she could find. The rest of the house remained dim, hallways stretching into shadow. Coda stood in the doorway, watching. "Come on," she said gently. He stepped into the room but did not lie down. The plumbing had been the first unpleasant surprise. When she turned on the kitchen faucet earlier, the pipes groaned as if clearing their throat after decades of silence. Brown water sputtered out in uneven bursts before slowly fading toward a clearer stream. Rust sediment. Probably harmless once flushed through. Still, she had filled only a single pitcher and set it aside, deciding to use bottled water for drinking until she could assess the system properly. Now, as night deepened, the pipes ticked softly inside the walls, expanding and contracting with temperature changes. The sound carried through the quiet like distant footsteps. Evelyn sat on the edge of the mattress and unlaced her shoes. Her knees ached from the long drive and the hours of cleaning. A thin layer of dust still clung to the cuffs of her pants. Outside, the town had gone still. No passing trucks now, no murmured commentary, just the low hum of crickets rising from the tall grass. For a moment, she allowed herself to exhale fully. She had done it. Bought the house. Entered it. Claimed it. But the stillness did not settle easily. From somewhere deeper in the house, near the back hallway, came a faint thud. Coda's head snapped toward the sound. "It's nothing," she said automatically. Another noise followed. A hollow, uneven knock. Not loud, but distinct. Coda moved past her and into the hall. She stood quickly, heart tightening in her chest. The floorboards beneath her feet dipped slightly as she followed. The hallway stretched long and narrow toward the rear of the house. The walls there were darker, wallpaper curling away from plaster in loose strips. A faint draft brushed against her arms, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. Coda stopped halfway down the corridor. His posture changed. Not aggressive, but focused. He lowered his head and took 2 slow steps forward, nose brushing along the baseboard near a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. His ears tilted forward. His body went still. Another dull sound echoed from within the walls, this time softer, like wood settling. "Old houses breathe," she whispered to herself. Well, that's what Daniel used to say when the cabin they'd rented years ago would creak at night. She reached out and touched the wall. Cool. Solid. Yet something about this section felt hollow. Coda lifted his paw and lightly scraped at the lower panel. "Enough," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She crouched and ran her fingers along the baseboard. It was dusty, but intact. No visible gaps, no obvious damage. The house groaned again somewhere above, as if responding. Evelyn stood slowly. She refused to let imagination run ahead of reason. She had spent too many years solving problems methodically to surrender now to shadows. "It's just settling," she repeated. Coda did not move. He remained planted in front of that same stretch of wall. After a moment, she placed a hand on his collar and guided him back toward the bedroom. He resisted slightly before finally following, though his eyes stayed fixed on the hallway until she closed the door. Inside the bedroom, she locked the handle, more out of habit than necessity. She lay down on the mattress, fully clothed, the lamp still casting its soft circle of light across the ceiling. The plaster there bore faint cracks branching like veins. The house responded with a series of small, unpredictable sounds. A faint tapping near the window. A distant rattle, possibly from loose gutters catching the wind. And beneath it all, something deeper, like pressure shifting under the floorboards. She turned onto her side. Through the thin door, she could hear Coda pacing once, twice. Then he stopped. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour. Now sleep came slowly. At some point in the night, a sharper bang jolted her upright. Her pulse raced. The lamp flickered again, dimming briefly before returning to full glow. Coda was already standing. His low growl vibrated softly in his chest. Not loud, but deliberate. "Easy," she whispered. She listened carefully. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voices outside. No breaking glass. Just silence. Gradually, her breathing slowed. She rose from the mattress and opened the bedroom door just an inch. The hallway lay dark and still. Moonlight filtered faintly through a rear window, casting pale silver across the floor. Dust shimmered in the beam. She waited. No movement. Coda stepped forward and once again drifted toward that same section of wall in the back hallway. He pressed his ear close to it. While Evelyn watched from a distance, uncertainty threading through her calm exterior. The house wasn't collapsing. It wasn't haunted. It was simply speaking, and she had not yet learned its language. After several minutes with no further disturbance, she gently called Coda back and closed the bedroom door once more. This time she turned off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room completely. The house continued its quiet breathing around her. And though exhaustion eventually pulled her into sleep, a single thought lingered just beneath the surface. This house was not as silent as it looked. Morning came pale and humid. Evelyn woke to a streak of sunlight cutting across the cracked ceiling, catching particles of dust suspended in the air. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the faint scent of damp wood and old insulation settled back into her awareness. Coda was already awake. He sat near the bedroom door, posture straight, listening. The house was quieter now. No midnight knocks, no unexplained thuds. Only the distant hum of cicadas outside and the faint ticking of pipes adjusting to the warming day. She pushed herself up slowly, joints stiff from the thin mattress. "Let's see what we've gotten ourselves into," she murmured. The hallway looked less ominous in daylight. Sunlight streamed through a small rear window, illuminating the very stretch of wall Coda had focused on the night before. In full light, it appeared ordinary, just another section of aging plaster above wooden trim. Still, Coda paused there again. He sniffed once, lightly, then moved on. Evelyn noted it but didn't dwell. There were more immediate tasks. The kitchen required attention first. She opened every cabinet, every drawer. Most were empty except for brittle rubber bands, yellowed newspapers, and the faint outline of where dishes had once sat for decades. She turned on the faucet again. Clearer this time. Encouraging. After a quick rinse of her hands, she grabbed her keys. The hardware store sat just 4 blocks away. Small, independently owned, its red brick exterior faded but upright. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside. Conversations paused. Not completely, not dramatically, just enough. The store smelled of oil, lumber, and metal filings. A tall man in his 50s stood behind the counter, flipping through a clipboard. He looked up. "You new to town?" "I am," she said calmly. "Evelyn Mercer." He nodded once, assessing. "Glenn Harper." She explained briefly that she'd purchased the Victorian at the end of Hawthorne Street. Recognition flickered across his face. "That old Bennett place," he said. "Didn't think anyone was touching that." She smiled faintly. "Well, I did." A younger man stocking shelves nearby let out a soft laugh. "Foundation's probably shot," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn pretended not to hear. "I'd like to schedule an inspection," she continued. "Electrical and structural, if possible." Glenn leaned back slightly, scratching at his jaw. "Hard to say without seeing it," he replied. "But from what I remember, that place has had water issues for years. A lot of folks say the ground shifts underneath it. Not exactly prime real estate." "Could someone come take a look?" He hesitated. "Oh, we're pretty booked up right now. Maybe next month." Next month. She felt the weight of that timeline. She needed clarity sooner than that. "I understand," she said evenly. "In the meantime, I'll take some heavy-duty gloves, a pry bar, and a moisture meter if you have one." That caught his attention. "Moisture meter?" "Yes." Glenn narrowed his eyes slightly, reconsidering her. "Back aisle, 3rd shelf." She gathered what she needed while whispers continued softly between aisles. "Won't last long." City people think charm fixes rot. She paid without comment. As she stepped back outside, sunlight hit her face full and bright. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Coda waited in the car, head lifted, eyes following her through the windshield. When she returned, he wagged his tail once, subtle, controlled. "Oh, see?" she said quietly as she placed the bag on the passenger seat. "We're not helpless." Back at the house, she began testing walls methodically. The moisture meter beeped softly in certain corners, higher readings near the back hallway. She crouched near the baseboard Coda had focused on. The meter spiked briefly. Interesting. Not dramatic. Not catastrophic. But higher than elsewhere. She stood, and stepped back. Outside, a pair of teenagers walked past the property, glancing toward her. One pointed toward the sagging porch rail. The other shook his head, smirking. Coda's ears twitched. He moved toward the front window, positioning himself where he could see them clearly. "Easy," she said. He didn't bark. He simply stood. That quiet steadiness did more than any warning growl could have. By late afternoon, the clouds began gathering in low gray clusters along the horizon. The air thickened again, heavier than the day before. Evelyn stepped onto the porch to examine the gutters. One section near the back corner had cracked clean through. Rainwater would run directly down the siding if a storm hit. She made a note to replace it immediately. Across the street, the same woman from the porch yesterday watched again, arms folded. "You'll want to check the basement," she called out suddenly. Evelyn looked up. "There's been flooding before." "Thank you," Evelyn replied. The woman hesitated, then added, "That house, it fights people." Evelyn almost laughed at the phrasing. "I don't mind a fight," she said calmly. The woman studied her a moment longer before retreating inside. By evening, the sky had darkened further, and a faint roll of thunder echoed far off, barely audible. Inside, Evelyn walked the perimeter once more, checking windows, ensuring they latched. The house felt less threatening in daylight, but the tension hadn't vanished. It had simply shifted. Coda returned to the back hallway. Again. He stood before that wall as if expecting something. Evelyn joined him this time without dismissal. She pressed her palm against the plaster. Cooler than the rest. The moisture meter beeped faintly again. The town believed the house was unstable. The contractor believed the foundation was compromised. The neighbors believed she wouldn't last a week. But this wall felt deliberate, not broken, intentional. Outside, thunder rolled again, louder now. Coda's body stiffened slightly. Not the first drop of rain struck the roof with a soft tap. Evelyn looked down the length of the hallway, toward the unseen rear of the house. Whatever this house was hiding, or protecting, it wasn't random. And somewhere beyond the laughter and doubt, a quiet tension was building. The rain never fully arrived that evening. It hovered instead, humid air pressing down, thunder rumbling at a distance but refusing to break. By morning, the sky had cleared again, leaving the yard slick and heavy with moisture. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee brewed from bottled water, studying the layout of the house in her mind. Back hallway. Slight moisture spike. Unusual temperature difference along one section of wall. Coda lay nearby, but not fully at rest. Every so often, his head lifted toward the rear of the house. Well, she set the cup down. "Let's look properly," she said. The kitchen drawers were stubborn. Most slid open with resistance, wood swollen from years of damp air. In the third drawer from the left, beneath brittle takeout menus and an old measuring tape, her fingers brushed against something folded. Paper. She pulled it free carefully. It was thick, heavier than ordinary printer paper, faded at the edges, creased from years of neglect. A blueprint. She unfolded it slowly across the kitchen table, smoothing the corners flat with her palms. The lines were precise, drafted by hand, not computer-generated. Measurements marked carefully in ink that had browned with age, the original structure of the house. Her eyes moved along the layout, tracing the staircase, the parlor, the kitchen. It was more detailed than she expected. Structural notes, elevation markings, drainage lines sketched beneath the foundation. And there, behind the rear hallway, was a section that did not align with what she had physically seen. A cavity, not large, not obvious, but intentional. Next to it, in red ink, was a small mark, almost like a circle drawn with urgency. No explanation, no label, just red. Her pulse quickened. "Coda," she whispered. He was already on his feet. She carried the blueprint down the hallway, stopping exactly where he had focused the previous 2 nights. She held the paper up against the wall, aligning the drawing with reality. It matched. The cavity sat precisely where the moisture readings had spiked. Her heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from clarity. The house hadn't been randomly patched or poorly built, but it had been engineered with intention. She ran her fingers along the lower paneling. The wood here was slightly different from the adjacent sections. Same paint, same wear, but a faint seam traced along one edge. Coda scratched lightly again. "Okay," she murmured. She retrieved the pry bar from the hardware store bag and knelt carefully. The first attempt yielded nothing but a dull scrape. The second loosened a small corner of trim. She paused. This could be nothing, or it could be something that changed everything. She set the tool down temporarily and examined the blueprint again. The drainage lines beneath the house were more complex than she'd assumed. Small notations pointed toward an underground diversion system connected to the old creek bed that once ran near this neighborhood before the factory expansion decades ago. Yet the town had paved over most of it, redirected it, but water remembered its path. A chill crept up her spine. If this cavity connected to drainage, if it had been sealed or altered improperly over the years, her gaze shifted toward the cracked gutter outside, toward the heavy sky that had threatened rain, toward the neighbors who had warned of flooding. The red mark wasn't decorative. It was a warning, a signal left behind by someone who understood the house intimately. Coda's posture changed. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stared at the wall as if waiting for her to understand. "I see it," she said quietly. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the siding with a low hiss. The sky darkened again, faster this time. A new roll of thunder cracked closer than before. She stood slowly, a blueprint still in hand. The town believed the foundation was unstable, but what if the foundation was stronger than anything else on this block? What if the weakness wasn't structural, but neglected maintenance? She pressed her ear lightly against the wall. For a moment, she heard nothing. Then, a faint sound. Not wood settling, not pipes expanding. Something deeper, like distant water moving beneath the floor. Her breath caught. Coda stepped closer, paw touching the exact seam she had loosened. Another rumble of thunder vibrated through the house, shaking dust from the ceiling. This time, the sky did not hold back. Rain began falling in steady, determined sheets against the roof. Evelyn stood in the dim hallway, blueprint trembling slightly in her hands, as realization sharpened into certainty. The house wasn't weak, and it was waiting. The rain came hard that night. Not the gentle tapping she'd heard earlier in the week, but a full, unrestrained downpour that flattened the tall weeds in the yard and turned the street into a glistening ribbon under flashing streetlights. Evelyn stood in the hallway, blueprint spread across the kitchen table behind her, as thunder cracked directly overhead. The lights flickered once, then twice. Then everything went dark. The power cut out with a hollow click. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the house came alive. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rattled the loose shutters. Water rushed down the broken gutter near the back corner, spilling freely against the siding. Coda barked sharply, once. "Okay," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. She grabbed the flashlight from her bag and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating dust and peeling paint. The storm intensified. Water began dripping somewhere deeper inside the walls. Not a leak from above, but something lower, closer to the floor. Coda bolted down the hallway. "Wait!" she called, following quickly. He stopped exactly where he had before, at the seam beneath the red mark's location. This time, he didn't just scratch. He pawed hard. The sound beneath the floor was no longer faint. It was unmistakable now, a rush, a heavy surge moving below the foundation. Evelyn crouched, pressing her palm flat against the lower paneling. It vibrated. Her pulse spiked. Rainwater was pooling outside. She could hear it splashing against the back siding. If the drainage system was sealed, blocked, or incorrectly closed, pressure would build. Was underneath the house. The moisture meter she'd left nearby beeped wildly when she pressed it against the wall. High. Too high. Another crack of thunder shook the structure. From somewhere behind her, she heard a sharp crack, wood shifting under strain. "Okay," she whispered, adrenaline sharpening her focus. She reached for the pry bar. The first wedge bit into the seam she'd loosened earlier. She braced her knee against the floor and pulled hard. The wood groaned but held. Coda barked again, urgent this time. "I know," she said through clenched teeth. She repositioned the tool, pushed deeper, and levered her weight against it. The panel snapped free with a sharp crack, splintering along one edge. Behind it was darkness and cold air. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow cavity within the wall, wooden framing, older than the visible renovation layers. And there, partially obscured by debris and insulation, was a metal mechanism bolted to a pipe, a manual valve. Her breath caught. Water thundered beneath the floorboards now, louder, faster. The valve was closed, completely sealed. The red mark on the blueprint hadn't been decorative. It had been a warning. The storm outside intensified, rain now pouring in sheets against the rear of the house. Through the open cavity, she could hear the trapped surge building beneath the foundation. If pressure kept rising, the foundation wouldn't crack immediately. It would shift. Slowly. Irreversibly. Evelyn shoved aside loose insulation and reached into the cavity. The metal was icy under her fingers. Rust clung to the edges. She twisted. Nothing. It didn't budge. Coda whined, went pacing beside her. "Come on," she muttered. Another sharp crack echoed from somewhere beneath the house. Not structural failure yet, but strain. She wiped her wet palms on her shirt and tried again, bracing her shoulder against the wall for leverage. The valve resisted, then shifted slightly. A metallic screech rang through the cavity as rust scraped against rust. "Move," she whispered desperately. With one final surge of strength, she turned it fully. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a deep, powerful rush roared beneath the floor. Water redirected. The sound changed immediately, from trapped pressure to flowing release. Outside, she heard the distinct splash of redirected runoff pouring into the old diversion channel near the property's edge. The vibration beneath her feet lessened. The house steadied, while she remained frozen in place for several seconds, breathing hard, flashlight trembling in her hand. The storm continued raging outside, but the violent tremor beneath the foundation had eased. Coda leaned against her, pressing his body into her side. She let out a long, shaking exhale. The house wasn't fighting her. It had been waiting for someone to listen. Rain continued pounding the roof, but the floor no longer shuddered. In the darkness, illuminated only by her small beam of light, Evelyn knelt before the open wall cavity. Water flowing freely now beneath the foundation, redirected exactly as the blueprint had intended. 7 days. 7 days after laughter and doubt and warnings, and the house still stood. By dawn, the storm had moved east, leaving behind a washed-out sky and a silence that felt almost fragile. Evelyn hadn't slept. She had stayed in the hallway for nearly an hour after opening the valve, flashlight resting on the floor beside her, listening to the steady current of redirected water moving beneath the foundation. The violent pressure had softened into something controlled, purposeful. When morning finally broke, she stepped onto the porch with Coda at her side. The street looked different. Water pooled along the curbs. Mud streaked the sidewalks. Trash bins lay tipped over. Lids scattered across lawns. 2 houses down, a man stood ankle-deep in his flooded basement window well, pumping water with a small portable unit. Across the street, the woman who had warned her about flooding was wringing out towels on her porch. Evelyn turned slowly. Her yard was soaked, but intact. The foundation walls showed no cracks, no seepage, and no muddy water creeping under the siding. The broken gutter had poured water downward, yes, but the surge that could have pooled beneath the house had been diverted. Guided away through the underground channel the blueprint had mapped decades earlier. Coda walked the perimeter carefully, nose low, checking every corner. His posture was relaxed now. No urgency. "You did good," she said quietly, resting her hand against his back. Inside, daylight revealed more clearly what she had uncovered. The wall cavity remained open. The manual valve, old but functional, sat at the center of a pipe system that ran downward through the foundation and out toward what had once been a creek diversion trench behind the property. She followed the pipe's path visually along the blueprint again, tracing the engineered logic behind it. No, this house hadn't been built casually. It had been designed, specifically to withstand water displacement from heavy storms. But at some point, During renovations or neglect or misguided improvements, the valve had been sealed shut and hidden behind new paneling, left closed, left forgotten. She crouched again near the open cavity, examining the mechanism in full light. The metal bore stamped initials faintly beneath the rust. CB. Her fingers brushed across them. Coda stepped beside her and gave a single quiet huff. It wasn't meant to flood, she murmured. The red mark on the blueprint had not been decoration. It had been a final note, a silent instruction left behind by someone who understood the land. She stood and moved toward the back door, stepping into the yard. Beyond the overgrown grass and sagging fence, she could see where water now flowed freely through a narrow trench that disappeared toward the old creek bed behind neighboring properties. The flow was controlled, not destructive, engineered. Voices rose down the street. "Foundation's cracked! Call someone!" Evelyn watched as two men struggled to pull soaked carpet from a flooded living room window. One of them glanced up and saw her standing dry and upright on her porch. His expression shifted from concern to confusion. "How's yours?" he called out. She met his gaze evenly. "Dry," she replied. He stared at her for a moment, then back toward his own house. Within an hour, a local contractor's truck pulled onto the block. Glenn Harper climbed out, boots already splattered with mud. He moved quickly from house to house, assessing damage. Eventually, he reached her driveway. He looked up at the Victorian as if seeing it for the first time. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes." "No basement flooding?" "No." He studied the foundation line carefully, walking around the perimeter. He crouched, ran a hand along the concrete, then stood slowly. "That's," he muttered, half to himself. "That's odd." Evelyn folded her arms lightly. "There's a drainage system," she said. "In that place?" He sounded skeptical. She gestured for him to follow her inside. In the hallway, she shone her flashlight into the opened cavity. Glenn leaned in, squinting. "Well, I'll be," he said under his breath. He reached toward the pipe, but stopped short of touching it. "This is old engineering," he murmured. "Pre-war era, maybe. Well, I've heard rumors that this house had some kind of custom foundation work done back in the 40s. Thought it was just town folklore." "It wasn't folklore," she said quietly. He straightened and looked at her differently now, not dismissively, but cautiously impressed. "You opened it?" "Yes. Just in time." He nodded once, absorbing it. "Most of these other houses," he said slowly, "they don't have anything like this. The factory expansion rerouted the creek decades ago. Water's been looking for a way back ever since." Coda stepped between them briefly, tail wagging once before settling again. Glenn studied the blueprint she handed him. "That red mark," he said. "Someone left you instructions." Evelyn looked toward the front window where sunlight now filtered through cracked glass. "They left the house instructions," she corrected softly. Outside, neighbors were gathering in small clusters, discussing damage. A few glances drifted toward her porch. No laughter this time. Only curiosity. The Victorian that had been dismissed as unstable was the only one standing untouched. The broken shutters still hung loose. The paint still peeled. But beneath it all, the structure had proven something no one had expected. It hadn't collapsed. It had endured. Evelyn stood in the hallway once more, staring at the open cavity and the metal valve now resting in its correct position. The storm had tested the house, and it had answered. Coda settled at her feet, calm at last. Outside, sunlight grew stronger, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the house felt less like a gamble and more like a decision. But by mid-morning, Hawthorne Street was loud with generators, sump pumps, and raised voices. Water had crept into basements up and down the block. 2 homes showed visible cracks along their lower brick lines. The yard across from Evelyn's had partially caved near the sidewalk, where runoff had carved a shallow trench overnight. But the Victorian at the end of the street stood exactly as it had the day before. Weathered, imperfect, but upright. Glenn Harper returned just before noon with a second truck behind him. This one carried a county inspector named Raul Martinez, a quiet man with careful eyes and a clipboard already damp from the humidity. They walked the perimeter again. Raoul knelt near the foundation, running his fingers along the concrete edge where redirected water had flowed cleanly away. He tapped lightly with a small hammer, yet listening to the tone. Solid. He stood and scanned the grade of the yard. This slope wasn't accidental, he said quietly. It was built that way, Evelyn replied. Raoul nodded toward the open wall cavity inside once they stepped through the front door. He examined the exposed pipework closely, brushing rust aside to reveal the stamped metal. This system was advanced for its time, he said. Most homes from that era didn't include manual runoff diversion, especially not residential. Glenn exhaled sharply. That's why it never made sense, Ramon, he muttered. Everyone always said this place had foundation issues, but it never fully collapsed. It just waited. Evelyn folded her arms loosely. Someone sealed the valve, she said. Raoul glanced up. Probably during renovation in the 70s, he guessed. New owners often close things they don't understand. If the diversion system was shut, pressure would have built under the slab over the years. Minor shifting, misinterpreted as weakness. Glenn gave a low whistle. Which means the house wasn't failing, he said. It was suffocating. Outside, neighbors began drifting closer. Not boldly, but cautiously. A man who had laughed from the pickup truck stood near the curb, staring at the intact foundation. You saying this thing's stronger than ours? He asked bluntly. Raoul didn't look up from his notes. I'm saying this one was engineered properly for the terrain. Murmurs rippled quietly among the small gathering. The woman from across the street stepped forward, wiping her hands on a towel. Why didn't we know? She asked. No one answered immediately. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, Coda beside her. Because it was hidden, she said calmly. Her voice carried more evenly than she expected. The man by the curb crossed his arms, frowning. That old place has been falling apart for years. Neglected, she corrected gently. Not falling apart. The distinction hung in the humid air. Raoul finished his inspection and approached her. You'll need to replace the paneling properly and protect the valve access, he said. But structurally, you're in better shape than most of this block. Glenn added, I'd like to take a deeper look at the original plans if you don't mind. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. Evelyn nodded slowly. I think I'd like to know who that was. That afternoon, as trucks pumped water from flooded basements and fans whirred behind open doors, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with the blueprint spread flat once more. Coda lay at her feet, head resting across her shoe. The house had been labeled unstable, unsafe. A mistake, but it had endured what newer renovations had weakened in others. She traced the original signature block at the bottom corner of the blueprint. It had been smudged with time, but faint lettering remained. C. Bennett. She leaned closer. The script was precise and deliberate. Designed by Clara Bennett, civil engineer. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. She had spent 3 decades navigating hospital systems that rarely acknowledged the women who kept them functioning. Meetings where her voice carried weight only after being repeated by someone else. Recognition often delayed or redirected. Oh, and here, beneath dust and dismissal, was the work of a woman who had built something resilient long before the town had been ready to credit her. Outside, the laughter from 7 days ago seemed impossibly distant. Instead, there were questions. How'd she know? Did you see that foundation? Maybe we misjudged that place. Travis called mid-afternoon, voice tight with concern. I saw the storm reports. You okay? I'm fine, she said. News says flooding across half the county. It didn't flood here. Silence. What? It didn't flood. She described the drainage system briefly. The valve, the blueprint, the redirected runoff. On the other end, Travis exhaled slowly. Mom, that's incredible. She smiled faintly, staring at the red mark on the paper. It's engineering, she replied. Just forgotten. By evening, the street had quieted again. Generators hummed softly, but the urgency had dulled. A few neighbors passed her house slowly, glancing at the Victorian with something new in their expressions. Not amusement, not pity. Consideration. Coda stood tall at the front window as the sun dipped lower. Evelyn stepped onto the porch once more, studying the house from the sidewalk. The paint still peeled. The shutters still hung crooked. The graffiti still scarred the fence. But the foundation, unseen, uncelebrated, had held firm. She placed her hand against the porch column. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. "They didn't understand you," she murmured softly. "Not to the house alone." Coda leaned lightly against her leg. For the first time since she'd turned the key in the lock, she didn't feel watched. She felt observed, and measured differently. The house that didn't collapse had shifted more than water that night. It had shifted a narrative, and Hawthorne Street was beginning to notice. The next morning, the street carried a different tone. People still hauled out soaked rugs and stripped drywall, but now there were glances toward the Victorian that lingered longer. A few neighbors nodded when Evelyn passed. No one laughed. Inside, she sat at the dining table with the blueprint spread open again, tracing the signature in the lower right corner. Clara Bennett, civil engineer. The name felt deliberate, steady, unapologetic. She had spent enough years in administrative offices to recognize professional pride when she saw it. The lettering was clean, precise, confident, not decorative, decisive. Coda rested at her feet, and one ear tilted as if listening to something distant. "I'd like to know who you were," Evelyn murmured. Millbrook had a small historical society housed in what used to be the old train depot near Main Street. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a part-time archivist, but towns like this kept their memories tucked away in filing cabinets and banker boxes. By early afternoon, she was standing at the depot's wooden counter. The archivist, a thin man in his late 60s named Raymond Cole, looked up from behind a stack of yellowing newsletters. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for records," she said. "Specifically on a Clara Bennett, civil engineer, around the 1940s. He blinked once. "Bennett?" he repeated, thinking. "That name's tied to the old Hawthorne Victorian, isn't it?" "It is." He adjusted his glasses and motioned toward a metal filing cabinet. "Most folks come in here looking for factory history," he said, pulling open a drawer. "Clara's story never gets asked about much." He flipped carefully through folders until he found one thin envelope, edges curled. "Here," he said, sliding it across the counter. Inside were a few newspaper clippings, brittle with age. A black and white photograph of a young woman standing beside a drafting table. Hair pinned back, chin lifted slightly, eyes sharp. Clara Bennett. The article headline read, "Local Woman Joins County Engineering Board, 1943. Evelyn scanned the column. Clara had been one of the first women in the region licensed in civil engineering. She'd returned home after college to design improvements to Millbrook's flood control systems when wartime industrial expansion began rerouting natural waterways. She had proposed reinforced foundations and runoff diversion for homes near the old creek bed. Several had declined her recommendations. One house had accepted, the Victorian on Hawthorne Street. Another clipping, dated 1948, carried a quieter tone. Board restructures. Position eliminated. The language was sterile. Funding shifts. Structural realignment. Changing priorities. Evelyn felt a familiar chill. "She was pushed out," Raymond said softly, reading her expression. Town leadership didn't care much for being told their planning was flawed, especially not by a woman. "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked. Raymond shrugged slightly. "Oh, she left town not long after. Records go quiet. No obituary in our files." Evelyn stared at the photograph again. The determination in Clara's posture felt eerily recognizable. "Her drainage system saved my house during the storm," Evelyn said quietly. Raymond raised his eyebrows. "That so?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. "Funny thing about this town," he said thoughtfully. "We celebrate factory owners and business leaders, not the people who quietly prevented disasters." Evelyn folded the clippings carefully and returned them. "May I make copies?" "Of course." Back at the house, she pinned the photocopied articles to the wall near the exposed cavity, just beside the red mark on the blueprint. Clara's face now watched over the hallway. Coda sniffed the paper once before settling down again. Outside, a local news van rolled slowly down Hawthorne Street. Word of the storm anomaly had traveled fast. A young reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, scanning the houses. She paused when she saw Evelyn on the porch. "Ma'am?" she called politely. "We're covering the flooding damage. We heard this property wasn't affected." Evelyn hesitated. She wasn't seeking attention, but Clara had been erased once already. "Yes," she replied. "It wasn't." The reporter approached, camera operator trailing behind. "Can you explain why?" Evelyn gestured toward the open cavity visible through the hallway. "Because it was engineered not to flood." The reporter frowned slightly. "Engineered?" "Designed in the 1940s by Clara Bennett, civil engineer." The name landed awkwardly in the air, unfamiliar to the crew. "Oh, never heard of her," the cameraman admitted. "Most people haven't," Evelyn said evenly. She explained the manual valve, the underground diversion channel, the red mark left behind as a silent instruction. As she spoke, neighbors gathered again, not skeptical this time, but attentive. "She tried to warn the town decades ago," Evelyn continued. "Her recommendations weren't widely adopted." A man near the curb shifted uncomfortably. "So you're saying this could have been prevented?" he asked. "I'm saying someone already solved the problem," she replied calmly. The camera captured the exposed mechanism, the stamped initials, the old blueprint. By evening, the segment aired on the local station. "Clara Bennett's hidden design saves home from flood damage." The name scrolled across screens for the first time in generations. Travis called again that night. "I saw it," he said quietly. "Mom, that was powerful." She sat at the kitchen table, looking toward the hallway where Clara's photo now hung. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said. "I just opened what she built." There was a pause on the line. "You look different," Travis added. "How?" "Confident." She considered that. Perhaps it wasn't confidence. Perhaps it was recognition. She understood now that the house had never been fragile. It had been misjudged, just like the woman who designed it. Coda rose and walked to the hallway again, but this time he did not paw at the wall. He simply lay down beneath Clara's photograph, head resting comfortably on his paws. The storm had revealed more than a drainage system. It had uncovered a name, and in doing so, it had begun restoring something the town had forgotten. By the end of the week, Hawthorne Street no longer felt like the edge of town. Cars slowed intentionally now, not to stare in mockery, but to look closer. A few drivers rolled down their windows, craning their necks toward the Victorian's tall silhouette. The peeling paint hadn't changed. The crooked shutters still tapped in the wind. But the story attached to the house had shifted, and that changed everything. A second news segment aired on Sunday evening. This one included interviews with neighbors describing how floodwater had surged into basements, while all the old Bennett place remained dry. Clara's photograph flashed briefly on screen, grainy but resolute. Evelyn had not intended for attention to follow her. Yet Monday morning brought it anyway. A small group gathered near her front gate just after 9. 2 local contractors, the woman from across the street, and a man from the county planning office who introduced himself as Howard Blake. "We'd like to take another look at the drainage system," Howard said, clearing his throat. "From a preservation standpoint." Evelyn studied him for a moment. "Preservation," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Inside, she guided them down the hallway. Coda walked beside her, calm but alert, positioning himself just slightly between her and the unfamiliar men. The exposed cavity had been cleaned and temporarily framed for safety. The valve remained open. Howard crouched and examined the pipe carefully. "This is remarkable," he murmured. "Oh, if more homes had installed something like this back then." "They didn't," Glenn Harper said quietly from behind him. "Most people didn't listen." Silence settled briefly in the narrow corridor. Outside, more neighbors drifted closer to the porch, curious but hesitant to enter. Evelyn stepped back and allowed the officials space to assess. The mood in the house felt different now, no longer tense but watchful. The structure had proven itself. The storm had done what no argument could have. Footsteps approached from the front door. "Mom?" Evelyn turned. Travis stood in the doorway, travel bag slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, anxious, and stunned. "You didn't tell me reporters were here," he said quietly. "I didn't invite them," she replied. He stepped fully inside, gaze sweeping across the hallway, the exposed panel, or the pinned photograph of Clara Bennett. "This is not what I expected," he admitted. "What did you expect?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "A collapsing staircase," he said honestly. "Water damage everywhere. You overwhelmed." Evelyn almost smiled. Instead, she handed him the blueprint. "Look." He studied the red mark, the drainage lines, the signature. "She designed this?" he asked. "Yes." "And it worked?" "Yes." Howard Blake stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Your mother saved more than her house," he said to Travis. "If that valve hadn't been reopened, we might have seen foundation failures down this entire stretch." Travis looked at her differently now, not with protective concern, but with something closer to respect. "You figured that out alone?" he asked. "Coda helped," she said lightly. The German shepherd wagged his tail once, as if acknowledging the credit. Outside, a few children pointed toward the house. One whispered loudly enough to carry. "That's the one that didn't flood." By afternoon, more people had stopped by, not to mock, but to ask questions. "What kind of foundation is that? Could we retrofit something similar? Do you think mine has anything like it?" Evelyn answered calmly, methodically, drawing from years of administrative leadership she hadn't realized she still carried so naturally. She explained what she knew, what she didn't. She directed them to Glenn and Howard for technical specifics. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she wasn't defending herself. She was contributing. Travis followed her through each interaction, watching quietly. Later, and as the crowd thinned and dusk approached, he stood beside her on the porch. "I was wrong," he said finally. She looked at him. "About what?" "About this being you shrinking. The yard still needed clearing. The paint still needed repair. But the house no longer looked abandoned. It looked intentional." "I thought I was protecting you," he added. "But you didn't need protecting." Coda settled at their feet, relaxed, tail gently brushing against the wooden boards. "I needed space," she said softly, "not protection." A local newspaper photographer arrived just before sunset, asking to capture a photo of the exposed mechanism and Clara's image on the wall. Evelyn agreed, but only if Clara's name appeared in full. "Not just the house," she insisted. "Her." As the camera shutter clicked, the neighbors watched from across the street, not with skepticism now, but with something that felt almost like pride. The house that had been the punchline of a joke 7 days earlier now stood at the center of conversation. When the photographer left, quiet returned gradually. Travis looked at the sagging shutters, the overgrown yard, the chipped porch rail. "You're going to fix all this?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded. "Tell me what you need." She glanced at him, surprised. "For now," she said gently, "just dinner." He laughed softly. Inside, Clara's photograph remained pinned above the exposed cavity. Coda lay beneath it, breathing slow and steady. The crowd that had once gathered to watch her fail had returned. But this time, they were watching her stand. The following weeks moved with quiet purpose. But the storm damage along Hawthorne Street had left its mark. New drywall stacked on porches, dehumidifiers humming behind open doors. But attention kept drifting back to the Victorian at the end of the block. Evelyn didn't rush the restoration. She began with the essentials. The exposed cavity was framed properly and fitted with a hinged access panel so the valve could remain reachable. Glenn helped install protective casing around the pipe to prevent corrosion. The broken gutter was replaced entirely, angled to guide runoff precisely toward the underground diversion channel. She insisted on doing what she could herself, scraping loose paint from the porch rail, clearing brush from the yard, removing graffiti from the fence with steady, patient strokes. Travis stayed for 3 days, helping where he could. And he repaired 2 loose shutters and replaced cracked porch boards. On his last evening, he stood back and studied the house as if measuring it against his earlier doubts. "It doesn't look smaller anymore," he said quietly. "It never was," she replied. After he left, Evelyn contacted the county preservation office. Howard Blake arrived again, this time accompanied by a woman in her 40s with a leather binder tucked under her arm. "I'm Elise Warren," she said, extending her hand. "Millbrook Preservation Society." They walked through the house slowly, Elise noting architectural details: the carved trim, the stained glass window, the reinforced base structure. "And this is the original blueprint?" Elise asked, studying the faded lines carefully. "Yes." "And the red mark?" "A warning," Evelyn said. Left behind." Elise smiled faintly. "Clara Bennett," she said. "I've been digging through archives since the news segment aired. There's more to her story than we realized." Evelyn's interest sharpened. "Like what?" "She submitted multiple proposals to reinforce flood protection across town," Elise said. "Most were dismissed as unnecessary, too expensive, too radical." Evelyn glanced toward the hallway where Clara's photograph remained pinned. "She wasn't wrong," she murmured. "No," Elise agreed. "She wasn't." By late spring, Evelyn had partnered formally with the Preservation Society, not as a symbolic homeowner, but as an organizer. Word spread that she would be hosting a small gathering, an informal workshop on home resilience for older residents who feared future flooding. The first Saturday morning, and only 5 people arrived. They sat on folding chairs in the parlor, sunlight filtering through newly cleaned windows. Coda lay near the doorway, relaxed but attentive. Evelyn stood before them, not with a microphone, not with a presentation slide, but with the blueprint in her hands. "I'm not an engineer," she began, "but I learned something important last week. Sometimes problems aren't new. They're forgotten." She walked them through the drainage system calmly, explaining how water pressure builds when pathways are sealed. She showed them the valve and how it functioned. The attendees asked practical questions. What about homes without diversion systems? Can we retrofit? Where do we even start? Evelyn directed them toward county resources, contractors willing to assess foundations, and the Preservation Society's growing archive of historical plans. The next week, 12 people came, then 20. Soon, Hawthorne Street was no longer just the location of the house that didn't flood. It was becoming a place where conversations about infrastructure, resilience, and overlooked design took root. Elise arranged for a small plaque to be mounted beside the front porch column. Clara Bennett, civil engineer, designer of the original 1943 flood diversion system. The unveiling was modest. No ribbon cutting, no ceremony. Just neighbors gathered quietly as Elise read Clara's brief biography aloud. Evelyn stood back during the reading. This was not about her, yet she felt something steady and warm in her chest as the plaque was secured into place. Coda sat upright at her side, tail sweeping slowly against the porch boards. Must the house look different now? Not because it was perfect, but because it was understood. The peeling paint was gradually replaced with fresh coats of muted gray-blue. The stained glass window was carefully repaired. The yard was trimmed back to reveal the foundation's careful lines. Neighbors who had once whispered now stopped by with questions about preservation grants. One elderly man brought over a faded blueprint of his own house, hoping to see if similar systems existed. Evelyn didn't become a spokesperson or a headline. She became a resource. And in the process, something else shifted inside her. The layoff letter from the hospital remained tucked in a drawer upstairs. For the first time in months, she realized she hadn't thought about it in days. Her identity was no longer tied to a title or an office, while it was tied to action. Late one afternoon, as she finished repainting the porch railing, the woman from across the street approached slowly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what? For assuming you'd fail?" Evelyn wiped her hands on a rag. "You weren't the only one," she replied gently. The woman nodded toward the plaque. She should have been remembered sooner. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. Coda stepped forward and leaned lightly against Evelyn's leg. The house stood quiet and steady behind them, not as a monument to survival, but as proof that strength sometimes hides beneath neglect. Restoring the Victorian had never been about aesthetics alone. It had been about recognition, of design, of resilience, of voices dismissed too easily. As twilight settled over Hawthorne Street, Evelyn stepped back and studied the finished porch. It was not perfect. It was deliberate. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not just settled, but useful again. Spring settled gently over Millbrook. The air no longer carried the heaviness of storm season. Instead, it moved softly through open windows, stirring lace curtains that had been washed and rehung with care. The Victorian no longer looked abandoned at the edge of town. It looked inhabited, considered. Sunlight filtered through the restored, stained glass window at the top of the staircase, casting faint blue and amber shapes across the hardwood floors. The cracks in the plaster had been patched, though not erased entirely. Evelyn had chosen not to smooth every imperfection. The house had lived. It did not need to pretend otherwise. Coda lay near the front door, stretched comfortably in the warmth of the morning light. His ears twitched occasionally at distant footsteps, but he no longer paced the hallway. The urgency that had once defined his movements had softened into calm vigilance. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, running clear water into a glass. The pipes no longer groaned when she turned the handle. The system had settled into a rhythm, like the house had exhaled and decided it could breathe again. Outside, Hawthorne Street looked subtly altered. 2 homes down, new drainage trenches had been dug along the curb. Across the street, foundation cracks had been reinforced. People waved now when she stepped onto the porch. Not because she had proven them wrong, but because something had shifted in how they saw her. The laughter from that first day still existed in her memory. Not the pickup truck. The muttered comment that she wouldn't last a week. 7 days later, something unexpected had happened. Not a miracle. Not luck. Listening. Trusting instinct. Opening what someone else had closed. She stepped into the hallway and paused before the framed blueprint now mounted properly beneath Clara Bennett's photograph. The red mark remained visible, circled gently in protective glass. The plaque outside had begun attracting quiet attention. Visitors sometimes stopped to read it. A few even left small flowers at the base of the porch column. Evelyn ran her fingers lightly along the frame. "You were ahead of your time," she murmured. Coda rose and joined her, sitting neatly at her side. She knelt and rested her forehead briefly against his. "You were too," she whispered. The house had been called run down, on weak, a mistake. But beneath peeling paint and weathered wood had been design, intention, strength hidden under years of neglect. She thought back to the boardroom months earlier, the polite phrasing, the elimination letter, the way colleagues had avoided eye contact in the hallway afterward. They had seen her as outdated, replaceable, a cost line on a spreadsheet. What they hadn't seen was the infrastructure she carried inside herself, decades of decision-making, crisis management, patience built through loss and survival. The house and she had shared something in common: misjudgment. Late afternoon brought a gentle knock at the door. The woman from across the street stood there, holding a small envelope. "It's nothing big," she said, handing it over. "Just a thank you from a few of us, for the workshop, and for showing us what we missed." Inside the envelope was a handwritten card signed by 12 neighbors. Evelyn read it slowly, feeling the quiet weight of each name. Coda wagged his tail once, as if approving. As evening approached, she carried a chair onto the porch and sat facing the street. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Children rode bicycles past, calling out to one another. The town no longer felt distant or suspicious. It felt curious. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, listening, not to the anxious creaks of a house under pressure, but to ordinary sounds. Wind through trees, distant conversation, the steady breathing of her dog at her feet. Sometimes people laugh because they mistake unfamiliar strength for weakness. Sometimes they see peeling paint and assume collapse. No, sometimes they assume age means decline. But strength does not always announce itself loudly. It often waits quietly behind a wall, marked only by a small red circle that someone thoughtful once left behind. What looked like decline had been hidden design, What looked like a gamble had been deliberate choice.
Sometimes, the right decision isn't the one that feels safest. It's the one that drew you still just your adjustment. Coda rested his head gently on her knees. The house stood steady behind her. Foundation firm, windows catching the last light of day. 7 days had been enough to change how the town saw the Victorian. But it'd taken a lifetime for Evelyn to recognize something else. She had never been Pharaoh, she had only been underestimated. And now, the sky turned about how wrong trees, the luster from that first morning filled the stand, small against the quiet certainty of the house, and the woman standing exactly where they belong. Sometime the world laughs at what it doesn't understand, at people, at old house, at second chance. But strain doesn't need the outflows to hone form. It only needs someone willing to see it. Have you ever been underestimated and laid the brood stronger than anyone has batted? Say your story in the comments. I truly love to read it. And each story like Evelyn Murray, consider subscribing so we can keep uncovering the hidden trend around it.